What do you think of the hypothetical conversations going around Kemba versus Kyrie, especially when people are seeing him drop 40 against the Celtics the other night?
I think my reaction is probably pretty similar to when it all happened. And I think people now, it's funny now because the sentiment to get Kyrie out of town was like a mob mentality. Like, everybody wanted to go to his house and pack boxes.
Welcome to AM Hoops. It's Casey Kiernan, a very special guest today. His name is Sean Grande, longtime play-by-play voice of the Boston Celtics. First, Sean, thanks so much for doing this. Really appreciate it.
No worries, Casey. I've learned very quickly that long time has become code for you're getting old. For 20 years now, I've been doing this job, and I do it with Cedric Maxwell for the 20 years. And so we obviously lost the great Tom Heinsohn this summer, but for years it was Mike Gorman, Tommy Heinsohn, Cedric Maxwell, and myself. So when you're in that group, you're always the kid. So I'm always the young guy. So in a very sneaky way, all of a sudden now I'm the longtime voice. And I had this big birthday coming up in a few months, and everybody now is jumping on me as I thought I was safe.
We will get to those memories and your favorite Tommy Heinsohn story in a bit, but we have to start with this year in the Boston Celtics. Now, obviously, the sky is falling crowd, and then you have the optimists who say, no, we're just saving Kemba for the playoffs. Don't worry about it. We got Jason and Jalen, and everything's going to be fine. We'll be a totally different team in the playoffs. Where do you stand on that? Who is this team actually when people ask?
I think they are pretty much what they are, which is a 500 team that has had Kemba out for half the time. He's not playing back-to-backs. You've had a slightly tougher schedule than most. You've played slightly more road games than most. But an interesting thing is happening in a league in which you usually have 5 or 6 tiers of teams. Clearly, in this very unusual year that nobody wants to call an asterisk season, but we all know that it is, I've never seen it happen this way, because usually only a few teams hang around near 500. And basically what you have now is 14 teams right in the middle. You've got 8 that have clearly separated themselves, and I'm including Denver in that group with a scoring differential, even though they've lost some close games. And you have 8 teams at the bottom, the Clevelands and the Minnesotas and the Detroits. And you've got 14 teams in the middle, which is usually reserved for about 4 or 5 teams, and there's 14 in the middle, all jockeying for position. I think the big picture here, the Celtics in the last 3 years have had Kyrie Irving, Gordon Hayward, Al Horford, Terry Rozier, Marcus Morris, all leave. And they've been replaced with Kemba Walker half the time and a trade exception. You cannot lose that volume of not only star talent, all-star caliber players, but older players, and not take the hit. I think in the big picture, when we look back at it, pose the question to some fans when they get a little rowdy is, what's more surprising, that this team is hanging around near 500, or that last year's team was the 3rd best team in the NBA and got within a game or two and a couple of plays here and there of going to the NBA Finals? I think last year's overachievement was greater than this year's underachievement.
So let's talk about the trade deadline. I know you probably can't say too much, obviously, specific names, but my philosophy has been that they should wait using the trade exception, if they're going to use it at all, because the tax bill, I think, would be enormous, unless they send money back out. But to wait, because I think bigger fish will be available then. Any tweak that they make right now for like a Harrison Barnes, no offense, but to me, that just uses some of the trade exception, and it doesn't do a whole lot of good. It doesn't do enough good. That's my philosophy, but then you have people who they can't accept that.
Well, remember, nobody wants to hear that. Again, as you said, rightly so, I'm sort of on both sides, right? I have to speak both languages. And the fans want action. And the fans want Danny to make a move. Got to make a move. Danny has to make a move. Well, that makes no sense, because for what? What are you doing? What move is it that's going to make you better? Maybe there's a scenario by which Harrison Barnes is exactly what they need, and that brings a couple of other things together. But that doesn't seem too likely to me. The Celtics certainly need to get older. That's the other thing that nobody really talks about, is that there was a moment in one of the back-to-back games that Kemba was out a few weeks ago. I looked down on the floor. I said, Max, tell me something. Tell me anything you noticed about this team in the 4th quarter for the Celtics. And it's that Robert Williams was the oldest player on the floor. I am all in on Robert Williams playing more. He can't start because he'd be fouled out in 9 minutes. But you playing him more, absolutely. I'm in favor of it. But fans, my caution to them is, okay, you want Robert Williams to play more? I'm with you. but don't complain when you lose more games, because that's how this works. You can't have it both ways. The Celtics have been better, significantly better, when Tyson's on the floor than Robert Williams. So can you be realistic about your expectations? Go all in on Robert Williams and Peyton Pritchard and Young. Make a move at the trade deadline that gets you younger. But at this point, I literally texted Bill Simmons yesterday, because his text to me complaining was like this. It was one of those ones like, oh my God, I can't even, I had to scroll, right, to see it. And what I've been texting people were saying the last day or so is, the MVP of the league, there's obvious choices, right? Joel Embiid, LeBron James, whatever. How about nominating Gordon Hayward for MVP of the league? Because his move took one team from the bottom of the league into the middle, and it took another team from the top and put them in the middle. And that's the Gordon Hayward shift. And what do the Celtics need right now? Harrison Barnes, Thaddeus Young. Need Gordon Hayward. That's the difference right now.
What do you think of the hypothetical conversations going around Kemba versus Kyrie, especially when people are seeing him drop 40 against the Celtics the other night?
I think my reaction is probably pretty similar to when it all happened. And I think people now, it's funny now, because the sentiment to get Kyrie out of town was like a mob mentality. Like, everybody wanted to go to his house and pack boxes, right? They wanted Kyrie out of town. Not only did you get it, but of all the moves that summer, it was Al Horford you didn't replace. It was, like the Terry Rozier spot, and the Kyrie Irving for Kemba Walker switch has been the least of the Celtics' problems. That was an unbelievable save, given the situations. The problem is that it cost you Rozier, on top of it. And again, flashback to when franchises make decisions and make big moves, and it either goes right or it goes wrong, and it starts you down a certain path. You could easily go back now. I know people that do this and say, you know what, never should have made that trade for Kyrie, because then you would have had Isaiah still here. Forget the fact that he, was unable to play and went from one of the top 5 players in the league to arguably one of the bottom 5 on that bum leg. Put all that aside, you would have had the picks, and you could have gotten Colin Sexton, and maybe if things bounce differently, you get Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, whatever. Okay, how on earth could you not trade Isaiah Thomas for Kyrie Irving and that pick? And you had to do that. You had to roll the dice. Danny Ainge for 6 years only had one regret about the new Big Three era, which is that Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce, and Ray Allen were too old when they started together. They were all in their 30s. So the idea was, the sentiment, the perfect scenario is put guys together who are in their 20s. And he did it. Put 3 elite players together. And the Gordon Hayward thing is the perfect example of Gordon left because he wanted to be the guy. But this exodus of high-level talent, and with the inability to replace it, of course the Celtics have dropped off.
Yeah. We've got members here at AM Hoops, and we allowed a couple of them to submit questions for you. We've got 4 of them, kind of a lightning round, so you don't have to spend too much time on it. But our first one is from Orlando Orengo. He asks, which former Celtic do you miss being on the team the most? Which I think is a little different from your favorite Celtic. Who do you miss being on the team the most?
Well, is that who do I miss on the plane the most? Like, if it is, I mean, there's a lot. Listen, there's a ton of guys now. As the longtime voice of the Celtics, there's been a ton of guys that have come through. But maybe the one you wouldn't think of when people ask me that question, like who is like a great guy to hang around with and be on the plane? Rasheed Wallace, without question, just an awesome dude. Came back, hung out with Max and I in the back of the plane the entire year, and was just as regular a guy as you can imagine.
Okay, Elon Simon, he asks, what is the biggest moment for you? And for me, I'm like, okay, he's going to say the 08 title, but maybe I'm wrong.
That's the easy one. And of course, it's championship. There's, I guess the other 2 answers outside of that I would give. And obviously, I've called a game 7 of the NBA Finals courtside. And the story I always tell about that is I sat next to, in Boston, we have this terrible broadcast location. I actually did those games from the hockey press box on the 9th floor. But in LA, we're courtside. Lakers were one of the last teams to go over to the dark side last year and take the broadcasters off courtside. So for the 4 games in LA, I've got a better seat than Dustin Hoffman and Eddie Murphy and Steven Spielberg, and they're all sitting behind me. And at one point, they come and they hand out they hand out the stat sheets, right, at each break. I'm sitting next to Doris Burke for all 4 games, and a great friend for all 4 games in LA. And she gets up to interview Doc at the end of the first quarter of Game 7, and I take the stat sheet. I take the stat sheet that's in front of me. I turn it over and I draw 2 circles, a big one and a very little one in the middle. And the big one I write world, and then the little tiny one I write us. And I just put it in front of her when she got back. And I realized that it's game 7 of the NBA Finals. The whole world is watching. And here we are, like kicking each other under the table like 12-year-olds. Like, do you believe where we are? But to me, I always felt, and this is a personal thing, when you get to that next level in your job and meet the moment, I like to think of game 7 against Cleveland in 2008, because you knew as it was happening, this is a game they're going to be talking about for 30 years. And just being in during that entire playoff run, it has to do with where you are in your life and your career. And I'm in my late 30s at that point. And I think I just got divorced, and it's like my whole life was that team. So the work, that was like the best work I had ever done. And here comes this game 7, and the history of Bird and Dominique. And all of a sudden here's Pierce and LeBron, and it's a game 7, and it's playing out in front of you. And the feeling in my mind, the Celtics were going to win that year. I felt it pretty early on that they were going to win. And you knew this was the game. If they win game 7, they're going to win the championship here. But as long as LeBron's on the other side, there's going to be drama. And it just had all those little things, and PJ Brown hitting the shot, and Eddie House ending the game with a steal. And you end up sort of channeling Havlicek stole the ball, It was just one of those moments where everything just kind of clicked. And it was sort of a next level game as an announcer. So I sort of remember that. I mean, there's been 2,000 games. So there's quite a few obviously stick out, but that's usually my answer to that.
That's awesome. Last thing that I thought of, do you have a Kobe Bryant story? I mean, you mentioned, and that's what was going in my mind when you're there, you're courtside in front of the celebrities. Tell us about Kobe.
Well, it's not obviously not a basketball story, but of all of the great games in the history of the Celtics-Lakers rivalry, which not only were, the famous NBA Finals, but there were a lot of memorable games in the regular season. One of them, and ironically, it was in the championship season. We had no idea at that point. There's no Pau Gasol, so we had no idea yet that the Celtics and Lakers are going to meet in the finals. But they played in LA right after Christmas. The Celtics went out on the road in the old school 4 games and 5 nights. The Celtics went out and swept a 4-game and 5-night trip out west. The final game was in LA, and I guess the Lakers at this point were doing it, not like they weren't selling out, but apparently they decided they were doing gimmicks from time to time. And that night, the gimmick at Staples Center was they were going to wear the short shorts from the 80s. Kobe eventually, after all the years, got to know a lot of the guys, and obviously knew Max very well because he knew the history of the rivalry, but he would always come over and talk to us because we were not only courtside in LA, because the Lakers announcers were not. There were 2 spots courtside, and Celtics TV was near the Celtics bench. We were always near the Laker bench on that other side, which is that never happened anywhere else. So we had this very unique thing. Kobe would always come over and say hi. But that night he comes out at they had changed at halftime and went back to the regular shorts because they were so uncomfortable. And Kobe just walked over and looked at us, and he looked at Max and said, "I don't know how you guys wore those things." The immeasurable loss. My wife had done a story with him about less than a year before it happened about his book coming out. And I think something I said at the time is that we cheated out of the second half of Kobe's life and the things he was going to do and the things he was going to contribute is unimaginable. And, last year being at that game in February, with all the celebrities and the people who were at the Celtics were the team that were there the day before the service at Staples Center. We played that Sunday afternoon game, and any of us that have kids, it's unfathomable what happened. And then I think the rest of 2020 became what it became, and all of our worlds went upside down. That it blurred the fact that that year began. That we lose David Stern on New Year's Day, and then just a viral awful moment.
Yeah,
for the ages.
Yeah, that whole year was obviously turned everything upside down, and we're still feeling the effects of it. Okay, General Woofles, obviously a screen name, asks your best Tommy Heinsohn story.
I think my personal favorite was after a couple, you basically, I don't say kept your mouth shut the first year or two, but listen, I learned more. That was a learning tree, right? Like the dinners I had with Tommy in the media room before the game, I learned so much for all those years. I'm eternally grateful. But I remember, you wouldn't always agree. After, I think it was my second or third year where I finally decided to say, like, when I disagreed. And it was a game where it was a tie game. Celtics had the ball. Paul Pierce took a shot. It wasn't a bad shot. It wasn't a great shot. He took it very quick, the shot clock. He left 5 or 6 seconds on the clock in regulation for the Clippers to win again. And Eddie House hits a game-winning shot. And I said at the time, you got to use that clock. got to go to overtime. You can't give the Clippers a chance to win the game. Max agreed with me. I get on the bus. Mike Gorman agrees with me, whatever. I mean, he's like, yeah, I know Tommy loved that shot, and Tommy had no problem with it. So I'm like, you know what? Okay, this is my time. And Tommy eventually gets on the bus, and we start engaging on this. And he's, no, you got to take that shot. And I'm like, Tommy, you can't leave time on the clock. Like, everybody agrees. And I turned back, everybody was gone. And like, they had just left me all alone to like they had just. But the Kevin Garnett thing sort of changed everything, because they were two guys staunchly opposed to the Kevin Garnett trade. Tommy said he'd quit if the Celtics traded Al Jefferson to get Kevin Garnett. So when he got here, I don't think they were that enamored with Garnett, whereas Max and I are kind of all in it. I'd spent that entire summer like basically pitching Kevin Garnett to Boston, because I had been with him in Minnesota, that this thing's going to be amazing. And then you realize Kevin Garnett came right away, and Max was talking about Larry Bird, who's the greatest player ever to wear a Celtic uniform, and how he compares with these guys. And I said one night, I made the mistake of saying, when the Bird thing came up and Tommy was very resistant to it, I said, well, it's not really Larry Bird that you compare him to. He's more under the Bill Russell umbrella and I didn't even say anything like that. I didn't say the Beatles are greater than Jesus or anything like that. I just said it's that umbrella under which you have to have that comparison, because Kevin Garnett really was the Bill Russell type of the modern era for that Celtics team. And obviously the reason should have been the MVP in 08, all those things, that Tommy was, anyone that threatened that legacy, which you can't. How do you threaten that legacy? You can't.
Right. But by the end, do you think Tommy would come around to that a little more, or no?
I think probably a little more, but Tommy dug in on what Tommy dug in on. There's no question. That's one of the reasons. It's not, it's funny because we don't have that feeling of how different it is. The Garden is a completely different place now. Now there's just players and referees and Mike and Scal and Max and I. That's going to change. Fans are coming back, in a couple of weeks, but we don't have that sense of how much we miss Tommy, because we haven't had any normalcy yet. We haven't had a normal game at the Garden yet, where things are back to normal, which we won't until the fall. And Tommy doesn't walk in, the door. But that was, of all the gifts I've had and the things I've been lucky enough to experience, having 19 years with Tommy as your sort of personal tutor, when he has just, the history of the game is on his face, and there's no substitute for that.
Yeah, that's awesome. We really do appreciate you coming on today. Great storyteller, as well as a great play-by-play guy. Sean Grande, happy early birthday, and thanks for coming on.
Appreciate it.